Hello, CS112. Today I'll be going over a quick solution to Lab 10, which has to do with exception handling. So you were to create a function called countAnimals, which takes two parameters, reducing factor and days. The reducing factor is a list where they all act as dividends to divide the cell count by. And days is how many days you would run your quote-unquote experiment for. You can assume that you always start with 100 cells. So this was sort of the code skeleton they gave you guys on the sheets. Also, we can assume that the length of your reducing factor list has to be greater than or equal to days. If it's not, you're supposed to raise an exception and display the string reduction not possible. Likewise, you need to assume that the type, you need to check that the type of the elements in reducing factor are integers, in order to do division. And if it's not, then you would raise the error message, error in reducing factor. So there are two different error messages here for two different things we need to check. So diving right into the code block here, I'm obviously going to set up my try and accept here. We're going to make this a little more detailed in a bit, but let's just think about what we need to do first. So what we want to do is, I actually didn't type it up here, but we need to go through this list, and for every element in this list here, we're going to take our starting 100 and divide it by this element, and then add 24. Let me actually double check it's 24. Yes. All right, so for every element, so for instance, this first iteration here, you have 100. You're going to divide it by 4 and then add 24. Then you're going to divide it by 7, then add 24. Now keep in mind that it is only this number of days, so you'd only do it for 1-2 days. You wouldn't continue to divide it by 1 and then add 24. And here I have all the test cases here. As you can see, there are a couple edge cases which will really test our the functionality of our accept block here. So I'm just going to dive right into it. So like I said before, I'm going to want to iterate through this list. However, we know that we have a specific amount we can iterate through this list for. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a counting variable, and I'm going to use a while loop. The reason I'm using a while loop is because we're doing it for we're iterating for a variable amount of times. We're not iterating the length of a list. So when you iterate a length of a list, that's typically more of a for loop. But since we're only going to be iterating days amount of times, I'm going to use a while loop. So I'm going to say while I, if I can type, is less than 0, what am I going to do? Well, like I said before, I'm going to take total animals and divide it by whatever reducing factor index I'm at. So I can just say total animals divide equal, and then reducing factor index. So now what does that do here? Every iteration of this while loop, I'm going to be, starting at 0 at the 0th index of reducing factor list here. I'm going to be dividing total animals, which is this number right here, by every index as we go on. Now, as I said before, we're also going to want to do total animals plus equals 24. And obviously, we are going to want to increment our I so we don't have an infinite loop here. And I just realized, well, I is greater than 0. I don't know if I said that while going through before, but we want to iterate as long as I is less than days. Like I was explaining before, we have a variable amount of times we're iterating through. So I'm going to make this a very generic accept just so my code runs well. I'm just going to say print found an error. And also I'm going to want to have my return statement within my try block, assuming my code works flawlessly. So we're going to run into a few errors here, but let's just run this code and see what happens. As you can see, we have gotten a bunch of errors here. So I didn't even, it looks like I didn't even get a single what's it called, a number here, which is fine. Let's just look into what I did here. So factor index. So let's debug this together. So it says found an error, none. So obviously it's going to return none if we found an error, but let's just see why it finds it. So while I less than days, total animals divide equal reducing factor index. Well, index is not defined. It's I. That was such a rookie move. Let's run that again. Okay, now I'm getting more numbers here. So let's go down here and see what our expected output is. So 31. So we got the first expected output. Next, we found an error, which we're supposed to. That's good. The next, we found another error, which we're supposed to. Then it looks like we found another error when we shouldn't have. Now let's look at this test case. Let's just examine this one alone. So as we're going through here, we're dividing 100 by 4, then whatever that number is by 7, and then when we get to 0, we're dividing a number by 0, which is, that's not allowed. So that's why it's throwing an error and just going right into found an error. So we need to have a case which handles for that. So the easiest way to do that is to simply check if reducing factor I is equal or does not equal 0, then we're going to do all this fancy stuff. But we're going to increment I regardless. So I'm going to leave this out of the I. So let's go ahead and let's save that. Run it again. And all right, so it looks like we have got the proper output now. So we've gotten the 31 we're looking for. We've also gotten the 55 and the 55. So that's good, that's good. However, we need to look at these two now. We have specific errors for these two things. So let's examine this first error here. Reduction is not possible, and that's whenever there's a length of your reduction factor list is less than the days you're doing it for, because that that just doesn't make sense when you're doing this project. So that's going to be kind of more of a generic exception you want to raise. So I'm going to actually do that one next. This is a more specific accept block. So I'm going to add an accept block right here, and it's going to say accept. And now, do you guys know what we would get? Why we're throwing an error here? Well, it's because we're trying to do 100 or whatever number divided by a, which isn't a thing. It's called a type error. So I can be very specific with these guys. Since I know what this might cause, I'm going to throw a type error. And well, if I accept a type error, I want to return this message here saying error in reducing factors. So I'm just going to say print error in reducing factors. I'm going to save that. I'm going to run it. And all right, so we got that down. We just need to fix this error message now. And since this is kind of like a catch-all generic message, it didn't actually specifically say you needed to throw this one. It just wanted you to throw the other exception, but we're going to throw this regardless. I'm going to make sure it's at the ends, because it kind of, as soon as an error is thrown in your try block, it's going to go to your first accept and then the next, until it finds the specific error it's looking for. So that's why you want to do more specific things first. And now what is this accept for? This is for the case reduction not possible if, like I said before, the length of this list is less than that. So how can I throw this? How can I incorporate this into my code? Well, first I'm going to want to change this error message to reduction not possible. But now how can we get here? Since this is not an error within the actual code, it's an error within the logic of our function, how can we throw it? Well, you should always do these logic checks the very first thing in your try blocks here. Excuse me. And you can simply have an if statement. So if the length of reducing factor, if the length of that is less than days, well, we are going to simply raise. Now, what does raise do? Raise will eject you out of here and just start checking your accepts periodically. Well, we know for a fact that this is not going to raise a type error. This is this is just a generic error. Just by saying raise, it's just a generic error, so it's not going to go into the type error one because this is too specific. It's just going to go to where we want it to. And now you can only do this because we were told that these are kind of the two things we need to look out for. It's kind of taboo to do this in actual practice, but let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So you can see we have gotten the expected output where you have 31, you have reduction not possible, then you have error in reducing factors, and then you have 55 and 55. Again, these nones are just here because when we have an error raised, we don't have a return value. So it's still printing out the return value of the calls, but there is one, so by default it is none. Let me know if you guys have any questions down below.